Good afternoon and welcome to the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. Welcome also on behalf of the Center for Advanced Studies, University of Rijeka, which I represent. I'm very pleased to have you all with us, especially our dear guests and our dear guests from Greece, and our host and guest coming from Vienna, but also from here, even Vejvoda. Well, I need to start with a kind of a confidence. I grew up in Student Cultural Center SKC here in Belgrade, and I saw first Nouvelle Vague films, Chabrol also, and it was even who translated those films. That was the start. Okay. And then again with guys like Marina Abramović, Raša Todosijević, Paripović, Era Milivojević, and then Dunja Blažević, Biljana Tomić, and others who are the scene, the artistic scene of the Belgrade in 70s and 80s. That was my youth, and that was Ivan's Akme, maybe, this engaged start, because Ivan gave us first translations of La Boétie, sur la servitude volontaire. He gave us Saint-Just, he gave us Robespierre, Rousseau, Claude Lefort, but also some others like from artistic scene, Isaiah Berlin, Hannah Arendt. This is all that Ivan translated from French, from Italian also, Gina Peri. And Lucio Coletti, Marxism and Hegel. All this is Ivan's starts before entering other zones of engaged life on the side of open society, but also German Marshall Fund, and now at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, where Ivan is a permanent fellow. I think it's enough. I don't want to be pathetic, but it's quite pleasure to kind of moderate. I'm not moderating, I'm just leaving you the floor, and I will follow you in what you are going to tell us about Europe, about the program that you are head of at the Institute for Human Sciences, but also on what Ivan thinks what we are having now at this moment, especially in the United States, because Ivan spent much of his
6 years.
Yeah, 6 years at the German Marshall Fund in Washington. So please,
okay.
The floor is yours.
Well, Sanja, thank you very much. Thank you to the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. Thanks to Petar and all the colleagues, older and younger ones. Well, this is very emotional. You shouldn't have gone back so far. I'd like to mention Professor Dr. Jovan Čekić, also who is part of the Student Cultural Center and the artistic scene, and now is teaching here at the university. Dasha Duhacek, lots of friendly faces from bygone times, but we're still here, and of course very honored to speak in front of Professor Judith Butler. And we just realized that we met, not probably, we met in Dubrovnik in 81, 82, 83, 84 at the Philosophy and Social Science course that was directed by Jürgen Habermas, by Dick Bernstein, by Zagorka Golubovic, by Mihailo Markovic, if you remember him.
Yes.
By Agnes Heller.
Yes.
By the Hungarian dissidents, by a lot of very, very great people. Axel Honneth was my peer then, Andrew Arato, Jim Cohen. Needless to mention, Anthony Giddens. Many people came through Dubrovnik, and in fact, the Inter-University Center was a harbinger of this institute, because it was the way that international intellectual solidarity played when the Praxis philosophers in Belgrade were kicked out of university in 1975. A number of people came together, Johan Galtung in particular, the Swedish social scientist, and they were able to convince the United Nations to open an international university center where then the Praxis philosophers of Belgrade were able to come and teach with their peers from Zagreb, from Ljubljana, from the rest of Yugoslavia, and with their international colleagues. So again, that was a very specific Yugoslav way of solving certain conflicts that existed in society. And then that was a way for some of us who, I was a student of Zagorka Golubovic, and that was a way then to continue being with them in the late 70s. So it was a very particular way. And then, of course, in Belgrade, this institute was the solution for giving them a space. This is a building where I've been many times over many years. So, as I said, it's an emotional moment, but let's not dwell on that. I've been invited to speak about Europe and where we are now. Sonia asked me to say a few words about what I'm doing. In Vienna, the Institute for Human Sciences is also a very particular institution. It was created by a Polish philosopher, Krzysztof Michalski, a phenomenologist who unfortunately passed away 5 years ago. And he created it because it was, in fact, bringing together, at the time of communism still, West European intellectuals with East European dissidents. This Vienna is a kind of not only a city of spies, of which Orson Welles brilliantly portrayed in The Third Man. It remains a city of spies, but it's also a city where East and West of Europe meet most intensely. And Michalski started bringing these people together. It's today one of the family of the Centers for Advanced Studies, like the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin or in Paris, and I know that this institute is part of that family. I think I'm actually on the board of that. And it's grown into an institution that has fellows during the year, junior fellows as well as senior fellows, which is not the case in other institutions, and it has projects. You may be interested to know that Zoran Djindjic was a fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, and that's where he translated the book by Reinhard Koselleck, which is, available in second-hand bookshops, I guess. So many people have passed. There are 5 permanent fellows. We have emeritus fellows like Charles Taylor and people of that ilk. And I run a project there called Europe's Futures that's funded by the Erste Foundation, a private foundation, Austrian foundation. And very simply put, we have 6 fellows per year working on a number of topics. The 3 topics that we work on are general issues of democracy and the backsliding regression of democracy, the whole issue of European security and foreign policy related to migration, asylum, and the third, not surprisingly, is the enlargement to the Western Balkans and issues related to that. It's a 3-year project until 2021. We don't know what will happen after that. Okay, so that was the lengthy introduction after the strong emotions of talking here and in my home city. I was reading an interview just before I came that Stefan Zweig gave to Les Nouvelles Littéraires in Paris in 1932. And you read the questions of the journalists in 1932, and they're exactly the questions that journalists ask today. You know, how do we get out of this deep crisis that Europe is in? Is there too much doom and gloom? You know, should intellectuals be speaking up more forcefully? You know, are politicians, you know, doing what they should do, or shouldn't they? Should intellectuals organize congresses? And Stefan Zweig is against congresses that always finish with banquets, and then, you know, nothing gets done. He suggests to Nouvelles Littéraires, why don't you send out a questionnaire to intellectuals asking kind of key questions, and that will then be a repository of kind of ideas. And he's asked about, you know, are intellectuals politicians or not? He says, yes, they are, because they think broadly and they can give, based on their consciences, a free view of how they see the situation and propose bold solutions for the problems of our current crisis and civilization. It's, of course, the time of the great economic crisis, 1932, and he's sort of all fired up to, you know, try and save Europe. And basically we're in the same situation. We're here to save Europe. Different type of crisis. And yeah, there's a very interesting question, and it resonated so much. He's asked, he says, you know, so many people say it's worse than it was. And you can just see him throwing his hands up in the air and saying, you know, are you crazy? What, we had a war 15 years ago, 1914 to 1918, where millions of people died, and you say it's worse now than it was when people were killing each other all over Europe. He said, look, let's put things into perspective. It's not good, it's difficult. There are situations that we must tackle, and let's take a deep breath and try and find the solutions that are necessary for the kind of crisis we're in. I found a text by Krzysztof Michalski in a conference that was organized on Europe in 2008 at the Institute. His first sentence is, Europe has never been in a deeper crisis than this. So this is the way, you know, that we address the situations that we're in. And it's certainly not worse than it was before. It's very difficult, I think, to kind of put it out there immediately. We are confronted with the question of our model of society and civilization. You know, are we going to continue building cars, and are companies going to run after profit forever in a situation when there's a question of global growth? Will we have big growth still in the Western world? World growth, the share of China in world growth today is 30%. We all depend on China. If there was not the now low 6.5% growth in China, you know, where would the world be? And that simply goes to state the very commonsensical thing is that we are so totally interrelated with each other, whether we like it or not, that we have to find solutions together. That is where Brexit shows you how ludicrous that whole adventure is. To put it simply, how to disentangle yourself from the European Union. It is humongous how big that challenge is, and we see that it will be very difficult to do that. And that, again, not to be too dialectical about it, everything is linked to the next thing. And just to take the example of the Irish border, I mean, the whole peace agreement, the Good Friday Agreement of 21 years ago was possible because there was the European Union, was possible because the United Kingdom and Ireland were part of the European Union. And even though these were two democratic countries, it still needed an American senator called George Mitchell to come and mediate between two democratic countries. Now just imagine solving the Serbia-Kosovo problem. And we see there are already lots of special envoys that have been nominated, but we can maybe deal with that in the Q&A if you're interested. So I think that Europe is confronted with a huge question. What is Europe's role in the world? With a rising China, a US that, needless to describe too much, with a Donald Trump, and where the US-China relation is really tectonically moving the world. I mean, with the trade war, with everything else that goes on between those two countries. So you have a return to geostrategic times. Ursula von der Leyen, the new president of the EU Commission that is going through the review due diligence process, has already called this commission a geopolitical commission, which is going to seek strategic autonomy for Europe. Because, to take one step back, Europe had the leisure after World War II to build itself as a peace project, to build its democratic institutions under the security umbrella of the United States. It did not have to worry about defending itself against, then in the Cold War, a Soviet Union, because American troops were based everywhere, and it had, of course, the nuclear deterrent, as did the UK and France, but obviously it was the key one. And what has happened since 2008, and especially then since Brexit and the victory of Donald Trump, is a huge wake-up for Europe that, we need to fend for ourselves. We need to begin thinking of how we go it alone if America suddenly decides to decouple and to become great again and alone again, and not care about whether we are attacked by Russia or some alien Martians or, you name it. And that, of course, is a huge shift in the way that Europe operates, because it had the leisure, as we say, fair weather conditions for all that period from 1945 until basically 2017, even though previous American presidents all have said to Europe, look, you have to organize yourself, you have to spend more on defense, we can't all do it for you, and you need to kind of rationalize your security and armed forces, which NATO calls pooling and sharing. Not every country needs an air force. Maybe you can share some of that stuff. And so Europe is having to think very hard because of these external challenges. And obviously Russia and China are not the only ones. There's the Middle East, where Europe has been totally complacent and was wishing away a problem, Syria in particular. Syria is on the doorstep of Europe. Often people who speak loosely say the Balkans are on the doorstep of Europe. No, we are inside Europe. We are the inner courtyard of Europe. Syria is the first door neighbor, as is the whole of North Africa. And to think that the rebellion and everything that was going on after the Arab Spring would just go away was naive, to be very polite about it. And then, of course, we had the migration crisis in 2015. Erdogan opened the floodgates, and Angela Merkel did what any human being who has a sense of solidarity would do. Many kind of smaller mistakes, not consulting with her European partners, etc., but accepted that. And suddenly Europe realized that, it has to deal with it. But who is active in Syria? Well, it's not Europe. It's Russia, it's Iran, it's the United States. And so Europe does not have a handle on this problem, and is simply a hostage to other people's decisions. I mean, the latest development, as you've seen yesterday, is that President Trump is allowing Erdogan to go into Syria and to, kill off Kurds. Well, we won't hold our breath on that, but we'll see what happens. Very, very dangerous, very, very dangerous development. And so the global strategy that was developed under the previous commission of Federica Mogherini, that was written by a friend and a colleague, Nathalie Tocci, who's the director of the Institute of International Affairs in Rome, spoke about the need for resilience, spoke about the need for strategic autonomy, and we've seen at Europe's slow pace the creation of a kind of security structure, the Permanent Council on Security, the PESCO, all these European acronyms that one has to kind of learn like poems. There's a European Defence Initiative that's been joined by 14 countries. This is more operational. And then there's the very big question about Germany. Why does Germany not take a more active role? We have President Emmanuel Macron, who has taken the lead with his kind of youthful energy. He won an election on a European ticket of optimism. Great relief in 2017 when he won. And he's really trying to lead the way, but he needs partners. And I often say, when Macron turns around, there's nobody behind him, no one to follow and to push that agenda. Chancellor Merkel, for all her excellent leadership, is a lame duck chancellor. And she does not have the energy to push bigger European ideas, the likes of which Stefan Zweig would have liked then, and probably if were he alive, he would be saying the same thing now. And Europe does need to really kick into higher gear on all fronts. On the economic front, on the Eurozone, it needs to kind of bolster that group of 19 countries that are part of the Euro. It has to move on its security issues. And on foreign policy, it needs to really have a stronger voice if it is to have a role in the world. The new elected high representative, the Spanish Foreign Minister Borrell, he had a hearing in the European Parliament yesterday, and he said, and it's sort of related to our region here, he said, and many of us have been saying it for years, if Europe is unable to integrate the Western Balkans and solve issues like Serbia and Kosovo, how the hell is it going to solve any bigger problem outside of its own core geographic territory? So the agenda is very important, and the way that Europe will do it is by muddling through, unless the roof collapses in the meantime. But there won't be any dramatic big sort of developments. Europe has always moved through small doors. That's what the Jean Monnets and the Altiero Spinelli said. There won't be sort of big triumphal arches through which Europe goes. It will be building blocks that will make it what it is today. And I think what needs to be reminded is that this is first and foremost a peace project. And that without that peace project, we would all not be here. Just a footnote, Timothy Snyder, whom some of you know, and who was and is a permanent fellow at the Institute in Vienna and spent the whole past year with us, he gave a big speech on May 9th at the Judenplatz in Vienna, the Jewish square where there's the monument to the Holocaust. And this lecture has been published. It's on YouTube. You can watch it. I recommend it because it's very interesting. And Tim said there that that Europe is this invaluable project that needs to be upheld, and that it's probably the best thing going in the world today. But there's a claim that he makes that I disagreed with, and we talked about it for a long time, and he sort of accepted partially what I was saying. He said that the European project, because it comes from his larger historical analysis framework, is basically a response to the end of empire. That countries like Britain, France, whose empires were crumbling, tried to find a way in which how you replace empire. And that, Germany that tried to create an empire through this very strange way in which Hitler tried to do it, then found a way of doing empire kind of peacefully. I said to Tim, look, that is not the only reason that the European Union came together. I think that's a fault to say that. I said, you can possibly say that, but you first have to say it is really Europeans coming together and asking themselves, how do we avoid doing war with each other every 30 to 40 years? I said, you cannot evacuate that question. And he did concede that that was the case. I said, look, the fact that France and Germany have not had war since 1945 is huge in European history. I mean, for 200 years, they have been at each other's throat, and we all among them and with them in the slaughterhouse of Europe. And for some, for some people, the founding fathers, they were mostly fathers, they came to this idea, look, we don't have to do this. Just like John Locke in 1689, watching Protestants and Catholics slaughtering each other outside of his window, say, wait a minute, do we really need to do this? And so he took his pen and wrote a letter on tolerance and said, yeah, no, we don't need to do this. We're all English people. Yeah, you're Catholic, you're Protestant, but there's a way in which we can do this. And I think what we saw with Europe was very similar. And so the fact that this project has lasted for so long, in fact, creates a problem for us. And the problem is, what does it mean to have lived 70 years in peace? Does that mean we have forgotten war? Does that mean that we have to do another war just to remind ourselves how good peace is? No, I don't advocate that, far from it. But there's something in the daily grind and in the habit of living in peace that makes you complacent. I liken Europe to the air we breathe. Until somebody, holds your nose, you don't realize that oxygen is basically how we survive on Earth. And similar things to Europe. When Europeans were confronted with Trump's victory and Brexit, suddenly they realized that somebody could cut off the oxygen supply. And suddenly you had an upsurge in support for Europe in all opinion polls, across all countries. Because suddenly it dawned on people that, my goodness, is it possible that we lose this and we go to a kind of Hobbesian situation of war of all against all? But that's not enough to have people in all countries, including Poland and Hungary, where democracy is backsliding, 75% say we love Europe and it's good for us. One needs to do more. And this is when the broader framework kicks in of globalization and the economic crisis of 2008. The subprime loan crisis, Lehman Brothers, all of that. Suddenly, what people felt for many years, that inequality was rising, the 1% was skyrocketing, and the rest of the people were stagnating and not feeling, and people in Europe and the US saying our children will not live better than we did for the first time about 10 years ago. And suddenly there was a realization that something's going badly wrong here. The rich are profiting and sort of the middle class is losing out. And then you get the migration crisis, you get the rise of radical Islam and terrorism. And suddenly, slowly, you get the buildup of anger, of fear, of disenchantment with the system, loss of trust in politicians, in political parties, loss of trust in experts. And then you get what the Americans call the snake oil sellers. You get the populists, you get the Mussolinis and Hitlers of our time, who are selling the simple solutions. Take back control. We had a person like that here in the late 80s called Slobodan Milosevic, who said, let's be svoj na svome. It's exactly a translation of take back control. If we huddle around ourselves, if we huddle around the people who speak our language, look like us, feel like us, everything will be okay. It's also called sovereignism. It's like Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France or Salvini in Italy. You know, just let's huddle, and this horrible world outside, Brussels is the new Moscow, they're dictating to us. I mean, Boris Johnson talking about surrender to, as if, you know, it was surrendering to Germany or something. These people are offering extremely simplistic solutions to very complex problems, and what we call very simply the global commons, climate change, you know, or challenges such as terrorism and global economic problems of social economic type. These can only be solved if we join together. Nothing easy about that, absolutely. And the fact that Europe is, as I said, confronted with these external challenges, and these are the internal ones that I'm mentioning now. What's happening in Hungary and Poland, the kind of urbanization, the declaration that it's illiberal democracy, and we can speak for hours about what that is. But the fact that with this kind of anti-migration speech in a country where there are no migrants, it's kind of the anti-Semitism without Jews, you have a situation where Europe is trying to juggle these people and to keep the boat together. Now, this rise of populism and far-right extremism, but also sort of far left in certain cases, has been described by many as part of this doom and gloom that, you know, Europe is going down the drain. I was in the US until 2017. There were so many newspaper articles, you know, Europe is disintegrating, the euro currency will disintegrate. No, the picture is never so black and white. The center is holding still, and there are a number of examples for that. For example, the vote of the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom, a unanimous vote by 11 Supreme Court judges that Boris Johnson did something unlawful. The European Parliament elections, where, yes, a weakening of the big two-party families, European People's Party and Social Democratic Party, but the majority are all pro-European. Yes, a rise of far-right members, but, you know, still very clearly pro-European. The bringing down of Salvini in Italy, another example, or the victory of Zuzana Čaputová as president in Slovakia, or earlier the victory of President Alexander van der Bellen in Austria. And latest, last weekend, in Austria, the far-right Freedom Party that had 26% nearly in previous elections is down by 10% to 16%. So it's not all doom and gloom. We're not out of the woods, certainly, in any way. But sort of people are responding. People in the streets, from Warsaw on the abortion law in Hungary, at Budapest against the internet law. You know, we can take many examples. People in the streets here for many months, simply venting their anger, asking for something better and much better. I wouldn't say these people are disenchanted. They are expressing their civic voice, the need for a better, more organized and orderly society. The key tenets of liberal democracy, the division of powers, between executive, representative, and judicial are being, are being shaken. Look at what's happening with the impeachment procedure. Look at the United Kingdom, the attempt of Boris Johnson to simply eliminate Parliament. All of these things are putting to a test democracy in a very big way. And the way that politicians need to respond is, to put it a bit crudely, is to go to the people, to listen to the people, and to be in listening mode more than anything else. At a time where the economy is not doing well, at least in parts of Europe. In the US, it's what it is, the lowest unemployment rate for many decades. And so the challenge that Europe faces, to put it simply, is the gap that exists between the expectations and the capabilities to deliver on those expectations. And I think that Europe will manage to do it, but it will take many hands on deck to do exactly that. We here in this country, and I think most of us were born in a country that no longer exists, called Yugoslavia. We have had to learn the lesson of history in the hardest way, even though we all were taught at school what all others were taught at school, that war should never happen again, at least in Europe, that the Holocaust should never happen again, that we must never see camps again. We were taken to the camps, we saw the movies, we read the books, and I, as a social scientist, didn't believe we would have war until it actually began. And at the last Dubrovnik seminar in 1991, I remember we had a conversation between Gvozden Flego, our colleague philosopher, who was a little more pessimistic than I am. He said, look, I think there might be skirmishes, etc. And I said, look, if there is something, it'll be low-level violence, and we'll get out of it. Maybe we'll have to, divide up, like Czechoslovakia was kind of announcing that it would have a velvet divorce. And yeah, so it hit, like, say, all of us, I guess, like a boomerang. And so all the social science and all the history knowledge that I had to be reviewed. And as you well know, it was a time when the end of history was being declared. So what I and many of us thought that we were an exception in Europe, going proverbially in the wrong direction on a highway where all the cars were going in one direction, we have unfortunately turned out to be the harbinger, the announcer of what was going to come 15 years later, with the rise of far right, with the rise of identity politics, with the rise of nativism, with the rise of sovereignism. It's very sad to say that, but I think that's true. And who will stem that tide? Well, as I said, it's being stemmed. The center is somehow holding. And so this country that has become 7 countries is something to ponder about, how history works. And to put it more dramatically, it means that the darkest times can come back. And does that relate to the fact that we've lived in peace for too long and that somehow we've forgotten the dangers that lurk there if we do not pay attention to what politicians are doing? Isaiah Berlin has this wonderful, simple definition of what a good government is. He said, it is to avoid the extremes of suffering. To avoid the extremes of suffering. Unfortunately, we had leaders who didn't do that. They took us to the extremes of suffering. And so we have come out of it with great difficulty, with great being late to the story. We had a prime minister who wanted to catch up. He was killed. And so, we are now muddling through in the best way we can, and that is why we need Europe and want to be in Europe. the current Foreign Minister of North Macedonia, Nikola Dimitrov, was asked in the Netherlands by, a kind of bit of a provocative journalist. He said, "So why do you want to join the European Union? Look, it's sort of falling apart on the edges. There's all these kind of rise of the far right." And Nikola, who's a good friend, simply said, "You do not know how it is to be outside of the European Union." And I think that says it all. And when asked the question, I say, look, if we had a referendum on entering Europe next Sunday, we'd have a great majority of people who want to join. Why do they want to join? It's very simple. Because people know that there's a little more certainty, a little more predictability, and a little more prosperity being part of that club of still 500 million people than if you remain outside in the cold. Not to talk about all the very practical things that you can move about freely, etc., etc. So I'd like to end, and I hope I haven't been going on for too long, because I still consider myself a bit of a political philosopher, and Machiavelli is one of my favorite authors. Machiavelli talks about fortuna and virtu, about destiny and virtue, to speak simply. So we're all buffeted by destiny. Destiny takes us into all sorts of directions. But Machiavelli said, we have our own virtues, we have our own capacities and capabilities. And if we are aware of the problems, and if we are aware that we can take a bit of our destiny into our own hands, can't do all of it because you're part of a bigger world, then maybe we can steer ourselves into a better direction and into a desired life of what he called the vivere civile and the vivere libero, the living a civic life of civility and a free life. Thank you.
Thank you Ivan very much. You are in time, of course.
Okay.
Disciplined as always. I would like to invite you for your comments and questions. We might, of course, make a pause and then. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was inspiring. My question is, I guess, a little bit provocative and critical. You said at one stage that leaving the EU means for Europe going back to what you pejoratively call the Hobbesian state of war of all against all. Mm-hmm. I mean, don't you think this is exactly the type of rhetoric that provokes those political actors and those movements in various European countries which are now pushing for various exits? The first was Brexit. Now we have in Romania the newest tendencies. What I hear is called a Roman exit. There's Czechzit as an initiative in the Czech Republic. It's this idea that if somebody leaves Europe, this leads back to some sort of savagery, which is almost pre-social. Don't you think this is exaggerated and provocative? I mean, Britain is not going to return to a Hobbesian stage of war of all against all. I mean, shouldn't we wait and see what happens? And I also have a problem with this idea that everybody who is pushing for an anti-European, or even not an anti-European agenda, but an agenda which does not see a particular country within Europe, that everybody is simply a myopic bigotist and populist. I mean, this seemed to be suggested by your lectures. Don't you think this is exaggerated?
Thank you very much for your question. It allows me to specify what I meant. And obviously, in a speech like this, when you say a Hobbesian situation, that's being a bit dramatic, of course, to kind of try and make a point. No, of course, I would differentiate anti-European from Eurosceptic and Eurocritical. I think most of us are Eurocritical. There are many things that are not good with the European Union. There are many inconsistencies. There's a lot of hypocrisy on them, and we see it on our case here. There's a lot of sort of realpolitik, and no need to use the famous Nutella example to talk about that. I think that, if I may disagree with you, we definitely saw a lot of exits being announced, you know, the Grexit, the Italian exit, the French exit. But now leaders like Salvini, who is now in the opposition, and Marine Le Pen, they've completely changed. They do not talk about exit at all. They say we remain in the European Union, but we change it from inside. That is the new mantra. I would say that really a fringe only in any country is for exit, because they look at the opinion polls, and in every country, I would say except maybe Greece, there are clear and full majorities for staying in Europe. And answering the question whether Europe has benefited you, they all say yes. In a Poland and a Hungary in particular, I think there are about 75% support for Europe. So I think that question is out. The other thing that I often say, just imagine a Europe in which Romania and Bulgaria are not today members of the European Union and NATO, with a Russia that invaded Georgia in 2008 and then invaded Ukraine and snatched away a part of Ukrainian territory and is supporting a rebel war in the Donbas region. So this flank of Europe, which we border, would be completely open to greater Russian meddling. So I think there was a geostrategic decision made then in 2004, or rather 2007, to bring Romania and Bulgaria in, of course to rectify a historical mistake or necessity that was done in 1945 when Europe was divided at Potsdam and Yalta, but also sort of, I like to say, the proactive teacher, you know, help the weaker pupil to become part of the class rather than sending them into the corner and leaving them out in the cold. Many people, as you know, have criticized bringing in Greece in 1981, saying that Greece was not ready. I would say that we are for the better for the fact that these countries are now inside the European Union. But I completely concur with you that Europe definitely needs to work a lot on itself. Not everyone has to be a member of the European Union. As you well know, many people here have said, we don't need to become a member of the European Union. Look at Norway, look at Switzerland. Well, yeah, great. I mean, look at their GDP per capita and look at ours. So, I mean, those are kind of false arguments about being that. Of course, you can stay out of NATO, and there are many countries out of NATO. That's a whole different discussion, but I would say it's rather better for a small country and a small region like ours, with all of the countries in the region. We're about 50 million if you put Romania and Bulgaria into the Balkan basket. It's better that we're sitting at the table where it's being talked about us.
Yeah, please, Sophia.
Thank you for your lecture. I was thinking about this, Timothy Snyder's, your argument. I'm thinking how maybe these two can go together. So the imperial past transformed into something which is now European Union, or Europe rather, can go with kind of preserving some sort of peace. So I was wondering, especially in view of Yugoslavia and its fatal breakdown, how can we think of some kind of peace without also having to have some kind of imperial past transformed into something else? Is there a way for Europe to thrive in peaceful way, but also somehow to redistribute its sovereignty? Which is at this moment absolutely not the case, and I think that Greece is, for example, the country today which is not opting for staying in EU for precisely that reason, because it has very palpable effects on this not a good distribution of sovereignty and power within European Union on itself. But it's just one example. I think that we can find the other ones as well.
No, I mean, certainly. Federica Mogherini gave one of her last speeches a few days ago at the annual conference of the European Institute for Security Studies, and I think she said something quite understandable that sovereigntists have a problem with, and of course Macron is someone who has been using this term European sovereignty. I don't think that the fact that you are pooling a part of your sovereignty takes away from your own national sovereignty. It can only strengthen the dignity and strength of your country if one is part of a team which is addressing these global commons problems. And I put everything in there itself. One thing, you know, is that people like Macron in their speeches have been saying, you know, we have lived a period of 70 years of peace. That is true for the west of Europe. And I always add and remind people, look, you know, Hungary was invaded by the Soviet Union in 1956. Czechoslovakia was invaded in 1968. The island of Cyprus was invaded by Turkey, and they're still have an unresolved solution. So there has been war on the European part of the European continent, but on its sort of eastern and southern flank. And that means that we're never far away from very dangerous kind of developments if things slip out of hand. If you look at the migration crisis, this is where Europe really has not done well. The fact that Italy and Greece have borne the brunt of the migratory flows, and that the rest of the countries were saying, well, you know, it's your problem, you're the sea border, and, you know, see what you're going to do about that. That is probably the worst of examples of where the European Union has failed, and it has had to start catching up. And this is where the multi-speed Europe comes in. You may have seen that 10 days ago there was this agreement between Spain, Italy, France, and I believe Greece to start now working together on distributing the migrants who are coming across the sea. You can also see, people have not noticed, the number of times that Chancellor Merkel has traveled to Africa in the past 3 years. I think she made 5 or 6 trips. Why? Because that's where the root cause is. Or part, you know, obviously Afghanistan and Iraq, all the bad things that the US did in deciding to invade these countries. So we are suffering the results of those bad policies. But Africa, the rising continent, whose population is skyrocketing, and, you know, we'll have, I don't know how many billion people in 30 years, one has to, you know, to go there and, you know, to put it simply, give money, give €1 there rather than giving 200 euros once they arrive here. And this is again a part of the global commons. We will be looking at what has been the history of the world, a migratory flow of people from kind of less developed areas to more developed areas. And that speaks as well to the European model. Why does everyone want to come here? Well, because there's quote unquote normal life. I mean, there's some semblance of human rights, of a possibility for a decent job, and to bring up your children in a public school system. And that speaks tons for what Europe has achieved until now. Is it perfect? No, it's very, very far from perfect. And because of the challenges that have arisen, it has to address these issues in a much more forceful way by doing it in a multi-speed way. I mean, there will never be consensus on all of these problems. And in fact, Europe has never been fully consensual. There, you know, the UK is not part of Schengen. Denmark has opted out, Sweden is not part of the euro, etc. So you can have different kinds of arrangements while being part of the same big family.
Here.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for speaking in your beautiful English. I think I'm among the few people here who needed you to do that, and I'm very grateful. I think that from the perspective of a certain U.S. left, we've looked to Europe precisely because there were models of social democracy that seemed so reasonable. The state agreed to finance healthcare and education and housing, and that these were considered to be fundamental obligations of the state and fundamental rights of citizens. And of course, in the U.S., none of these are rights. They're all spoken about as entitlements, or more and more under the current regime, the ability to live somewhere or have health care is a question of individual responsibility. And if you have the job that gives you money for that, fine, and if you don't, we abandon you. What is most painful to see is the decimation of norms, ideals of social democracy, which would probably be called socialism where I live. I mean, you know, why Bernie Sanders is a socialist is beyond me. But anyway, but seriously, the decimation of social democratic ideals with the rise of neoliberal economics. And my sense is that those who are very skeptical of Europe are not skeptical of Europe's ability to ameliorate the possibility of intranational war, or as you have pointed out, I do think that's a real accomplishment. But what is, of course, worrisome is the place of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in promoting neoliberal economic processes. So you, for instance, point to growth, which I understand. I mean, I suppose there's a no growth argument on the part of climate change activists that would be an important rejoinder. But my concern has more to do with the question of how those European partners who are deciding economic policy and undermining social democratic ideals, especially through the terms, say, of the loan structure to Greece. I mean, the populism that you're pointing to is in some sense a response to the fact that people are living with greater debt and with fewer public goods. They've been outsourced, they've been marketized. There's greater insecurity in relationship to jobs. There's greater precarity in the structure of employment, and between that precarity and rising debts, there's a loss of a way of life which used to be called Europe, which did embody those social democratic ideals, at least for some or for many more than now. So although I don't think, I don't totally agree with Snyder's notion that the European Union is the way to resurrect a lost empire for these nations. I think there is a new constellation of power that has to do with who is imposing the terms of loans and how neoliberalization has been imposed from some European countries on others, such that we now have a very stark sense of who is at the center of Europe, who's at the periphery, and who's at the south. And those are economically induced inequalities from within this Europe. So I'm just wondering how you would address those issues, which I think are at least among the serious criticisms I've been exposed to.
Well, Judith, thank you very much for so eloquently and succinctly putting the key challenge, which sort of, where I use the word globalization basically to describe the negative effects, along, of course, with the beneficial ones. The one additional thing to say, of course, is the whole technological revolution and the artificial intelligence, the digitalization. There are constantly newspaper articles in the Western world and in Europe which say, in the title, 50% of jobs in Europe can be digitized. And I think that adds to the uncertainty, to the fear, and to the anger, because people who have a job simply say, you know, will I have a job tomorrow? And, you know, I want to reach out to that guy who says, don't worry, I'll fend for you. Or those who don't have a job, will I ever have a job? And you're absolutely right, the kind of the gig economy, the precariousness of jobs, the kind of McDonald's jobs, the moving from one job to the other with no social security, I think is kind of the bane of the times, and that is what drives a lot of the anger. So people, I think it needs to be said, people who vote for these, some of the people who vote for these far-right parties are perfectly decent people, but they're desperate. They're you know, trying to find someone who they think, illusionary, but who they think will find an answer to them. When Trump says, you know, I will solve this for you. I mean, we've heard that before in the 30s and 20s. And I think you're absolutely right. There's something about the neoliberal economic model that has to do with these problems. A friend of mine, Richard Parker, who teaches at Harvard, you know, he says, we constantly talk about deregulation. He said, no, that's the wrong word. It's the rich people regulating for themselves. And I think, you know, when he said it, it seemed so obvious. I mean, you know, if you allow something like subprime loans, you cannot have, the market won't solve the issues. And you don't have to have read Karl Polanyi to know that the state has to come in at some point and redistribute, regulate some things and say simply, this is the red line. You know, the market won't solve this because people like those who engaged in subprime activities simply wanted more and more and more, and it couldn't last. It was kind of a pyramid scheme that ended. And that's why I think the European model of the welfare state, which obviously because of a whole set of circumstances, and I'm not an economist, but you know, could not continue in that way. But we need to rethink that whole thing. I still firmly believe that we need public schools, that we need public health care, and maybe there's a price to pay at some other end in the budget of a union or of a state. I mean, having lived in America and having seen, you know, how students come out of university with, you know, a debt of anywhere from 20 to 100,000, you know, for us Europeans, if I can say that, is simply, wow, what kind of life is that? You know, you haven't even begun anything and you have to earn to pay back. And that is why many people want to come here and study in these places. So, you know, I think, and that was my point about saying, you know, we have to rethink our whole way of life. I mean, because obviously there's a lot of money around, it's going in one direction, and we're losing out on some key kind of tenets of modernity, and I would say solidarity is a key part of that we need to fend for each other. And you're absolutely right to mention Greece. I think that was a rather outrageous way of dealing with it, because remember, and many people are not aware, the way that the bailout worked was basically to bail out German and French banks who had been giving this money to Greece. So it's about saving themselves, not saving Greece. And there were only here and there articles, I remember one on the front page of New York Times that explained the kind of boomerang. The money comes in and goes out back to Western European banks. It could have been solved early had there been an awareness that it will cost less yesterday than the day after. And that is why there's been an accumulation of that. And of course, putting Greece at the kind of loss that it had. But then there were other strange situations that occurred when other European countries were asked to come and help Greece. And then I remember Slovaks saying, wait a minute, the Greeks, even with their diminished pensions, have an average pension of 800 euros, and we in Slovakia have pensions of 200 euros. How are we going to help them in this balance? And people will remember that here in our country said, give us a Greek crisis, please. We want pensions of 800 euros. So, huge lesson learned, huge fallout, lots of Greeks who left the country in the way that people are leaving all our countries now, including Romania and Bulgaria. 3.5 million Romanians have left Romania in the past 15 years. That's a huge hemorrhage. There's a declining population, an aging population in all of our countries, and the International Monetary Fund, has warned Serbia officially that you will have a problem with growth. I mean, and labor employment. If I can just add a footnote to the migration crisis issue, Poland today has 1.5 million Ukrainians who are working in Poland. In the mid-90s, when there was a meltdown in Albania, Greece took in nearly 1 million Albanians after the crash of the whole pyramid schemes there. No one talked about it. It was barely new. I mean, we followed it because we're in the region. And yet 1 million migrants came from all parts of the Middle East and Africa to Europe, and it was a huge crisis. So there are differing stories here, not to mention that Serbia took in 250,000 Serbs from Croatia in the span of a week in 1995 when they were kicked out. And people showed solidarity in various ways. So again, Europe is very slow to move, but I would say that the biggest question is the one that you raise. How is this model going to persevere and retain its status of an equitable, socially beneficial society?
Okay.
Yeah.
I hold the mic. Surprisingly, I'm asking you for a point of clarification about Russia. I think if one is to hear your lecture from, let's say, rhetorical perspective, it felt like you present Russia as a possible threat to Europe, and also used the distinction between Europe and Russia. Do you allow for some other possibility of these relations? I can imagine an argument saying that from historical perspective, peace in Europe was not so much a consequence, or did not depend so much on keeping Russia on a leash, but on creating a balance between these different interests. And also, I think geographically, and many people would say also culturally, huge part of Russia is also in Europe, and huge part of Russian population is in Europe geographically. And maybe another argument that could be said is that for I think maybe a decade and a half, there was a rather, as if Germany and Russia found a silver lining in their relations, and it functioned rather well until fairly recently, one could say, till Americans, interfered or something like that. Okay, so it's not so much that I'm asking this question from the depth of my heart, but I could imagine here in Belgrade many people having that kind of, perspective. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, and again, it allows for clarifications. I mean, clearly Russia is a European country, or at least parts of it. Its culture, its civilization, its literature. I mean, we've always considered it as European. After the fall of communism in 1989 and the Berlin Wall, there was a lot of talk about Russia joining the European Union or becoming a very close partner. And that lasted until the end of the Yeltsin era and basically until the beginning of the 2000s. There were many mistakes made vis-à-vis Russia. That's undoubtedly the case in the 90s, the way that it was treated and the way that it felt belittled by the West. And that is why then we saw what became of Russia under Putin. I wouldn't say that America changed the relationship between Germany and Russia. It was Russia that changed it by invading first Georgia and then invading Ukraine. I mean, at least we thought after Yugoslavia broke down in a bloody war that, no European country would attack another country by militarily. And until then, the relations were good. I mean, Russia was part of the Russia-NATO Council. I mean, there was great cooperation. Let's not mention the denuclearization that worked hand in hand with the US and Ukraine and all these big forces diminishing their nuclear forces. So there was a kind of dynamic, but Russia realized completely rightly they're a country in a category of their own. They're a country with 11 time zones, and if they won't join the European Union, they won't join NATO, but they can have a good relationship. The other important thing to say is that Europe is, for a great part, dependent on Russian energy. 30% of gas supplies to Europe come from Russia. And the whole discussion about Nord Stream 2, after Nord Stream 1 was successfully implemented, is also about that. And it means that for example, Serbia is 100% dependent on Russian gas. The point is not to stop Russian gas, it's to diversify. You don't only have one friend in life, you have many friends, and you go to different friends for different things. So diversification of gas and oil supply is extremely important, and Russia plays a key role in that. They definitely have a leverage. I mean, they benefit because they earn, but they also need to sell it to someone. And the fact that President Macron invited Vladimir Putin to the Biarritz summit of the G7 is indicative of, I think, what you're alluding to. We must have good relations with Russia. I mean, you can't avoid a country that's your first neighbor. Beyond I mean, it's a neighbor of the Baltic countries, of Latvia and Estonia. And of course of Ukraine, which wants to become part of Europe. So I think in the real world, you need two to tango, and there's a need to kind of sit down and discuss a variety of things. But the way to improve relations is not by invading your neighbor and snatching away a territory. That really soured the relationship. I mean, Georgia, the invasion of Georgia was somehow swallowed, and they just took away South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which is about 20% of Georgian territory, and they said now this is not Georgia anymore. As I said, that was somehow digested, if that's the right word. But then the invasion of Ukraine was really kind of, well, you don't do something like that. Bob, I think you.
Yeah. A couple of things. One of them is we had some discussions on some of these same topics in 1990, 1991, 1992, as we were getting Sloksit and Kroksit. If you'd been trying to persuade the Slovenes that they should stay in Yugoslavia, you would have had some of the same resistance now that you're getting from. But that's another story. But I want two clarifications, if I may. I'm not sure what the lesson was learned from Greece, is one. But the other, I'm not a great fan of Vladimir Putin's, but having been in the United States during the Georgia War and the like, I mean, we have to remember that NATO was formed to keep the Soviet Union from invading West Germany. And when there's no Soviet Union and there's no West Germany, what's the point of NATO? And the aggressive expansion of NATO to Georgia. The Georgian War was about taking out a NATO base that NATO had built to NATO standards. That was the Russian military goal, and it was what they gleefully did. And you know, the invasion of Ukraine actually also followed the revolution there, which was in part directed by the Americans using Otpor, which actually gets me to a question as I'm hitting the streets every week with everybody else in the demonstrations here. Where's Otpor? No, seriously, where's Otpor?
Otpor has grown up and they have jobs.
Yeah, well, they had jobs then too.
No,
and that was the job. But I do think that the NATO thing, you've kind of passed over it. And referring to Russian meddling, I'm always interested why Russia meddles in Europe as opposed to what other countries do in Europe. And then again, if I look at what Putin has done in Russia, it's interesting to see that in the Yeltsin era, life expectancies in Russia tanked. And the figures released last week were that life expectancies in Russia are back up. The Putin era was a disaster for Russians. And I'm sorry, the Yeltsin era was a disaster for Russians. And the Putin era has been, for many Russians, a big improvement.
Well, yeah, lots to say there in many different ways. The one thing that, for example, Lavrov keeps saying, you know, these countries are being forced by the US and European Union to join the European Union and NATO. You know, for the first time in history, all of these countries are choosing by themselves whom they want to join after, you know, the Austro-Hungarians, after the Ottomans, after the Soviets. You know, what was called the return to Europe, there was no doubt where people wanted to be and with whom they wanted to be. So I would say that this is not some kind of Western conspiracy. Russia is obviously a very complex phenomenon, and as I said, it's a country in its own right. We all have to deal with it, if for nothing else for energy, but also for other reasons. I think they're meddling, just like Trump now, you know, wants to see a weak Europe. I think Putin wants to see a weak Europe, so that there isn't, you know, this force that's there, constantly showing, you know, and then of course portraying himself as the conservative defender of the real Christianity, where, you know, marriage is only between men and women, and you know, whatever else that whole kind of ideology portrays to stay in power. I mean, the fact that he didn't allow oppositional candidates to run in local elections speaks a lot of why Russians are now standing up and saying, wait a minute, you know, what's going on here? You know, there's no ideal place on the world, but I think that people choose where they feel there's a little more freedom and of expression and life. Russia will remain great. It won't go anywhere. We will have to deal with it. And the obvious thing that I didn't say was about peace and war in Europe is that when, and you know this very well, when Tito broke off with Stalin in 1948, Yugoslavia had, I think, the second or third largest army in the world, and Stalin did not do what he did in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia because he knew the Yugoslavs would fight. And when I was serving my military service in the 70s, we were fighting the Soviet Union because they had invaded Czechoslovakia, and Tito turned all the defenses of the country to the eastern borders because you never know. So, yeah, and I agree. On Georgia, Saakashvili did a lot to provoke, you know, the Americans pushed him, but he was also being a bit provoked by the Russians on the border with South Ossetia. He kind of got a bit of a full head, thought he could take South Ossetia, and then he got a slap in the face from the Russians. So yeah, things are more complicated than they are. I mean, the frozen conflicts in Transnistria, in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, these are all little levers where, you know, you can heat the temperature or cool it. I don't, you know, I've always said, look, Russia will not invade a NATO country, nor will it invade the Baltics, nor will it, you know, it is worried, rightfully from a Russian perspective, about its near abroad, about Ukraine and Georgia. From a Russian perspective, you can understand that. But there are ways in securing yourself with the neighboring countries. You see the difference in which Hungary and Poland treat Russia. Obviously, in Poland, the Russians are what they are. Orban has a close relationship. He's allowed, you know, people who have been convicted in Western courts to go back to Russia. And yet Orban maintains sanctions on Russia because of Crimea. And there Europe has managed to keep a strategic unity. And that is why I think they get a free pass on other things, because they keep kind of the big questions untouched. On Greece, the lesson on Greece is, I mean, you know, those of you who followed Greece closely, you know, the Greeks never, in any opinion poll, wanted to leave the European Union and didn't want to leave the euro either. And that was very interesting. Even though in the referendum, when they were asked, you know, is what's happening right or wrong, you know, they had their day of referendum where they say, no, this is all wrong, what's happening. So that the next day they went back to their opinion, no, we don't want to leave the euro. That's why Tsipras stayed in the euro, and that's why Varoufakis was such a disaster for Greece, because he thought that, you know, you could have some totally different kind of world where Greece was in fact totally integrated into the European economy.
Athena? This is the Greece coming to us. No, it's just Athena.
Okay, just a very brief comment. Thank you so much for your wonderful lecture.
You didn't know that.
I have been interpolated somehow as a Greek person, which I am not very comfortable with.
As a political scientist.
Okay, I think, well, you just pointed to a very interesting event, you know, this apparent paradox between the decision, you know, the outcome of the referendum, right. You know, which said, well, there's something very wrong about the austerity bailout programs, and on the other side, the you know, almost horizontal pro-European stance of the Greek people. Well, and this is actually where the Syriza government was really based, because its mandate was not actually to leave Europe and the EU, but try the impossible, you know, to democratize Europe, try to change Europe from within, as you said before, but in a social democratic way. So, and I mean, that was very interesting because I found it a very, you know, it was a dialectical moment in this trajectory that you so eloquently described. Because I think this is the crux of the matter here, in the sense that I think what is important here is to think maybe a little further what is really defendable about Europe as a political project, and what is not. And when we see how the austerity bailout, IMF, Central European Bank programs, how they really jeopardized the democratic configuration of Europe, then we might be a little wiser regarding how we can really act to, you know, counter the resurging neo-fascism, racism, and all that. And Judith Butler talked later about the importance of, you know, the demise of the social welfare systems in Europe is something that really jeopardizes democracy. So if we think Europe as a political project in which democracy and democratic configuration of politics is very central, then we might want to think further about what we have to do to really defend Europe. And I think this is something that keeps coming back to me, something that Etienne Balibar had said some time ago, that maybe instead of thinking of Europe as a bordered continent, we should actually shift to a different perspective and see Europe as a borderland. And I think this follows very well what Dipesh Chakrabarty had said about how important it is to provincialize Europe and stop having this, you know, self-person centered narrative about Europe. This was not a question, just a comment, and thank you so much for your talk.
No, I would thank you very much for saying what you said. I'd just like to remind us all, in fact, of our own responsibilities. And on the case of Greece, it's obviously the whole political dynamic of the two kind of dynasties of the Papandreous and the others, the kind of outrageous nepotism, you know, the kind of clientelism of the system that, you know, led to the fact that George Papandreou becomes prime minister, and he discovers that the public budget deficit is not 7 or 8%, but that it's, I can't remember, 13 or 14%. So, you know, the previous prime minister, Karamanlis, lying and faking that everything is okay. In fact, the country is down the hole. So Papandreou becomes the right person in the wrong place at the wrong time. I mean, his career as a half-decent politician, you know, ends in catastrophe because he, like Gorbachev, has to proclaim the show is over, people. We've spent all the money, you know. We need to kind of change, you know, change roads at this point. And so again, it's not only the fault of the big bad West and the IMFs, it's something we did to ourselves. We didn't, and I think that the European Union has a huge responsibility in that. And in my naive way, you know, when Greece became part of the euro, and we know that was faked as well, because it wasn't ready to join the euro, I would have said, okay, geopolitically it's important that we have Greece in the euro, but let's go to the side room and say, you guys are not ready, and we know why you're not ready, so let's quietly now work to make you ready as you are part of the euro, and first of all get your statistics in place, because you have bad state statistics. And the poor guy who ran the statistics, you know, he was put in jail by Syriza, or not at all of his own account, and he's, thank God, freed from that. But one man cannot be at fault in a state that is serious about knowing the numbers about itself. So what I'm saying is, you know, there's blame to be apportioned in various ways. Of course, you apportion bigger blame to the bigger actor, and that is the European Union that did not take care of Greece as a if I can put it, a junior member state. And then once you hit, you know, at some point you will hit the wall if your governments are not responsive. You know, if they are aware of Isaiah Berlin's, you know, a claim that you need to avoid the extremes of suffering. And in a sense, this Greece had a version of that, because nobody was taking care about the pocketbook while there was a spending thrift, you know, the Olympics and all of that. So yes, I think we have a lot to learn from Greece and the way that Greece is dealing with migration and all of this. We'll see how it ends. But I mean, in the end, Greece is in the European Union. It is still part of the euro, and you know there are beginnings of a recovery that have begun.
With a lot of sacrifice behind.
I mean, I won't even go in where we are in these things.
If I may,
Sure.
it's we were discussing, and I was just all the time thinking, and it was de quoi l'Europe est-elle le nom? I'm paraphrasing here, but it's the translation might be. So, what is Europe the name? What is it? Mm-hmm. Is it only this? We discussed it through somehow Schumannian perspective of, okay, it's economical, and we start with this, and we go through this line of liberal, neoliberal, ultra-liberal, whatsoever it is above this. But what else? It's not only this. It's not only economical, political, geostrategical Europe. Where are the people?
Well, I mean, idea is a geographic place and an idea, and that's really what you're asking. I mean, and that's what I think the Enlightenment was about, or the Renaissance, to go even back further. It's, you know, how do we endow and empower individuals to take care of their own fate and to become responsible about their own fate without transcendental, you know, power somewhere above, but to, you know, realize that we are the makers of our fate and that we need to sit down together democratically and decide how we want to live as a society together. And that's the whole kind of democratic history and dynamic, you know, from its very beginnings in Greece, but then, you know, it moved on, and we realized that, you know, that was not too fair, and that all that was won in the streets of Europe and the US, and many people died getting universal suffrage, getting social benefits. You know, think of the workers' movement, of trade unions, of, you know, women's suffrage, of the 1936 in France, achieving, you know, guaranteed social benefits and holidays, and all this. None of this came on a silver plate. All of this was fought for. So, you know, one answer to what you're asking is we need to keep fighting for that idea, for the people. I mean, there's no way around it. Every morning you wake up, democracy is being questioned, and if we don't, you know, live and rise to be aware that it is such a fragile thing, and that's why we need to go out into the streets sometime to defend it, because there are constantly people who, you know, either get elected or force themselves into power and are trying to take all the power away for themselves. And I think Europe has, in a sense, been one of these places where democracy and the right of the individual to decide on her or his own fate has made quite a long way forward. I mean, the US is another place. India is also a very interesting place. You have GDP per capita of $1,900, and yet they are the biggest democracy. And Modi is one of these, you know, high-octane masculine figures, you know, where Erdogan and Putin and etc. And Trump and Bojo belong.
Ivan, thank you very much.
Thank you,
it was
Sonia.
very fruitful, and I find it passionate also. Sometimes
you need passion for these things.
to find me among political scientists, because for my head of a philosopher, I'm always somehow above the GDP and about the numbers and metrics, and thank you for giving us this occasion to hear a very large perspective, and especially from your experience, because this is what is talking also. You're here to testify all your others, starting with Rousseau or Saint-Just.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your patience, and